Edward II's red-hot poker execution was designed to leave no evidence. When you think of medieval royal executions, you probably picture public beheadings, dramatic hangings, or perhaps the theatrical cruelty of drawing and quartering. But there was another king whose death was designed with such methodical precision that it would leave no trace of murder whatsoever. In the grey stone corridors of Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire during the autumn of 1327, a deposed monarch would meet his end through a method so ingeniously brutal that it would burn away all evidence of the crime, while simultaneously serving as the ultimate symbolic punishment for his alleged sins. This was not merely another political assassination in an age where royal blood was spilled with disturbing regularity. This was the calculated destruction of a man through a technique specifically chosen to satisfy multiple requirements. It needed to be undetectable to any examination of the corpse. It needed to inflict maximum suffering to satisfy his captor's desire for revenge. Most importantly, it needed to send an unmistakable message about the consequences of certain behaviors that medieval society found particularly abhorrent. The victim was Edward II of England, a king whose 20-year reign had crumbled into complete catastrophe by the winter of 1326. The man who should have been England's defender had instead become its greatest liability. His kingdom lay in ruins. His wife had fled to France with their teenage son. His greatest enemies controlled his government and his person. Yet none of these political disasters would determine the precise manner of his death. That would be decided by something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. Edward's relationships with male favorites had provided his enemies with the perfect justification for both his deposition and the specific method they would choose to end his life. The red-hot iron rod that would be inserted through a horn into his body was selected not just for its ability to kill without leaving external marks, but as the ultimate expression of contempt for a king whose sexual preferences had scandalized medieval England. The night of September 21st, 1327, would witness the culmination of years of careful planning by Roger Mortimer and Queen Isabella. They had successfully invaded England, overthrown Edward's government, forced his abdication, and imprisoned him in one of England's most secure fortresses. But keeping a deposed king alive posed enormous risks. As long as Edward breathed, he remained a rallying point for potential rebellions and a constant threat to their authority. The solution they devised was breathtakingly cruel in its sophistication. The method would ensure that Edward died in agony while leaving his body unmarked by violence. Any examination by church officials or potential supporters would reveal only what appeared to be natural death. The technique required careful preparation, precise timing, and the complete cooperation of Edward's guards. Most importantly, it demanded absolute secrecy from everyone involved. What you will discover about Edward's final hours will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval justice, royal power, and the lengths to which desperate people will go to eliminate their enemies while maintaining plausible deniability. The England that Edward II inherited in 1307 was a kingdom at the peak of its medieval power, blessed with efficient government, military dominance over its neighbors, and the hard-won respect of European monarchs who had learned to fear English armies and English determination. His father, Edward I, had spent 40 years transforming England from a rebellious collection of feudal territories into the most formidable military machine in Western Europe, conquering Wales, subduing Scotland, and establishing royal authority over previously independent nobles. Yet the prince who would inherit this magnificent legacy possessed neither the personality nor the political instincts necessary to maintain what his father had built through decades of ruthless competence. Edward of Caernarfon, as he was known before his coronation, had grown up in the shadow of a father whose very presence radiated the uncompromising authority that medieval kingship required. Where Edward I was stern, focused, and absolutely committed to the expansion of royal power, his son was frivolous, easily distracted, and fatally attracted to the kind of companions who would ultimately destroy his reign. Born on April 25, 1284, at Caernarfon Castle in Wales, Edward spent his childhood and adolescence receiving the education befitting an English prince. He learned to read and write in both English and French, studied the classical texts that formed the foundation of medieval scholarship, and received extensive training in the martial arts that would be essential for any king who hoped to lead armies in person. His tutors reported that he was physically strong, intellectually capable, and possessed of the quick wit that characterized many members of the Plantagenet dynasty. But Edward's character was already revealing the weaknesses that would eventually destroy him. Unlike his father, who had demonstrated remarkable consistency in his choice of advisors and his determination to surround himself with competent administrators, Edward showed an early tendency to form intense emotional attachments to companions who possessed charm rather than ability. The young prince seemed incapable of distinguishing between personal friendship and political alliance, a confusion that would prove catastrophic when he assumed the responsibilities of kingship. The most significant relationship of Edward's early life began in 1300, when Piers Gaveston joined his household as a minor attendant. Gaveston was the son of a Gascon knight who had served Edward I faithfully but without particular distinction. The young Gascon possessed the kind of wit, charm, and physical beauty that appealed to Edward's romantic nature, but he lacked the political intelligence and administrative competence that the heir to the English throne desperately needed in his inner circle. The precise nature of Edward and Gaveston's relationship has been debated by historians for centuries, but the evidence strongly suggests that their bond transcended conventional friendship and entered territory that medieval society found deeply troubling. Contemporary chroniclers used language that clearly implied sexual intimacy, describing how Edward felt such love for Gaveston that he entered into a covenant of constancy and bound himself with him before all other mortals with a bond of indissoluble love, firmly drawn up and fastened with a knot. Edward I recognized the dangers posed by his son's attachment to Gaveston and attempted to address the problem through increasingly severe measures. The aging king repeatedly separated the two men, sent Gaveston away from court, and eventually exiled him entirely from England in 1307. According to one account, Edward I's rage at his son's request to grant Gaveston the county of Ponthieu was so intense that he physically attacked the prince, pulling out handfuls of his hair before ordering the immediate exile. But the damage was already done. Edward's emotional dependence on Gaveston had become so complete that the prospect of permanent separation was unbearable. The prince's determination to be reunited with his favorite would override every other consideration, including the stability of his future kingdom, the loyalty of his nobles, and the security of his dynasty. The political education that should have prepared Edward to rule wisely had been overwhelmed by personal obsessions that would make effective governance impossible. Edward's problem was not that he loved men instead of women, but that he allowed his personal relationships to override his political responsibilities. A homosexual king who governed effectively while maintaining discretion about his private life could have ruled successfully in medieval England. But a king who elevated unworthy favorites, ignored competent advisers, and repeatedly chose personal gratification over political necessity would inevitably face rebellion regardless of his sexual orientation. The first clear signs that Edward's reign was descending toward catastrophe appeared in 1310, just 3 years after his coronation, when his determination to restore Piers Gaveston to a position of prominence at court triggered the most serious baronial revolt England had experienced since the reign of King John over a century earlier. The immediate cause of the rebellion was Edward's decision to ignore the terms of Gaveston's exile and bring his favourite back to England with extensive new honours and responsibilities that violated every expectation of appropriate royal behaviour. Edward's handling of Gaveston's return demonstrated all the political incompetence that would characterise his entire reign. Rather than attempting to negotiate a compromise that might have allowed Gaveston to remain in England while addressing baronial concerns about his influence, the king simply announced that his favourite would be restored to his former position and granted additional privileges that placed him above England's most powerful nobles. The Earl of Warwick's furious declaration that Gaveston was a stage player who deserved to be kicked out of England reflected the widespread outrage that Edward's decision had provoked among the political class. The rebellion that followed revealed how completely Edward had misunderstood the nature of medieval English kingship and the delicate balance of interests that kept the realm stable. The barons who opposed Gaveston were not motivated by personal jealousy or arbitrary hatred of foreigners. They were defending a system of governance that depended on the king's willingness to consult with his natural advisers and to distribute royal favour according to established principles of merit and service rather than personal affection. The ordinances of 1311 that temporarily resolved this crisis represented one of the most sophisticated attempts at constitutional reform in medieval English history. Rather than simply demanding Gaveston's exile, the baronial opposition created a comprehensive framework for limiting royal power and ensuring that future governmental decisions would be subject to noble oversight. The 41 provisions of the ordinances addressed everything from military appointments to financial administration, but their central purpose was to prevent any future favourite from acquiring the kind of unchecked influence that Gaveston had exercised. Edward's response to the ordinances revealed both his fundamental misunderstanding of English political culture and his complete inability to distinguish between personal desires and political necessities. Rather than accepting the limitations on his power as the price of maintaining his throne, he immediately began plotting to circumvent the reforms and restore his freedom of action. His public compliance with the ordinances was accompanied by secret negotiations designed to gather support for their eventual repeal and revenge against their authors. The return of Gaveston in 1312, despite the explicit terms of his exile under the ordinances, demonstrated that Edward had learned nothing from his previous humiliation and was determined to pursue the same self-destructive course, regardless of the consequences. The king's elaborate efforts to conceal Gaveston's presence in England while secretly restoring his influence showed both desperate cleverness and profound political stupidity. Edward was intelligent enough to devise complex schemes for evading baronial oversight, but too obsessed with his favourite to recognise that such schemes were ultimately impossible to sustain. The hunt for Gaveston that culminated in his capture and execution in 1312 revealed the depth of noble hatred that Edward's policies had generated and the king's complete isolation from the centres of real power in his own kingdom. When Thomas of Lancaster and his allies cornered Gaveston at Berkeley Castle, they were not simply pursuing a royal favourite who had violated his terms of exile. They were eliminating a symbol of royal tyranny whose very existence threatened the constitutional settlement that protected noble interests. Gaveston's execution was carried out with a deliberate brutality that was designed to send an unmistakable message about the consequences of defying baronial authority. The favourite was not merely killed, but beheaded like a common criminal, his body denied proper burial, and his death celebrated as a victory for English liberty against foreign corruption. The symbolism was obvious and intentional. The king's most beloved companion had been destroyed by the very nobles who were supposed to serve and support royal authority. Edward's reaction to Gaveston's death revealed the dangerous combination of grief and rage that would drive his future political decisions and ultimately lead to his own destruction. Rather than accepting the favourite's elimination as the inevitable consequence of his own poor judgment, the king internalized the event as a personal betrayal that demanded revenge against everyone involved. The emotional trauma of losing Gaveston transformed Edward from a merely incompetent ruler into an actively vindictive enemy of his own nobility. The years immediately following Gaveston's execution witnessed Edward's systematic campaign to destroy everyone who had participated in or supported the favourite's elimination. This pursuit of vengeance consumed royal resources, destabilized English government, and created the kind of chronic instability that made effective rule impossible. The king's determination to punish his enemies took precedence over defending the realm, managing the economy, or maintaining the governmental institutions that his father had spent decades creating. The emergence of Hugh Despenser the Younger as Edward's new favourite in the late 1310s completed the king's transformation from incompetent ruler to active threat to English stability. Unlike Gaveston, who had possessed charm and wit but little political intelligence, Despenser combined personal ambition with genuine administrative ability and a ruthless determination to exploit his relationship with the king for maximum personal advantage. Where Gaveston had been content to enjoy royal favour without challenging existing power structures, Despenser actively sought to reshape English government in ways that would benefit himself and his family. The period from 1322 to 1326 witnessed Edward's transformation from a merely incompetent king into something approaching a genuine tyrant, as his partnership with Hugh Despenser the Younger created a system of government that combined royal authority with private rapacity in ways that threatened the fundamental interests of England's political class. Despenser possessed all the qualities that Gaveston had lacked, but combined them with an ambition and ruthlessness that made him infinitely more dangerous to the stability of English government. The legal framework that Edward and Despenser created to justify their activities represented one of the most sophisticated perversions of governmental authority in medieval English history. Rather than simply ignoring existing laws and procedures, they carefully manipulated legal processes to create an appearance of legitimacy while pursuing objectives that were fundamentally criminal in nature. Despenser's acquisition of other nobles' lands proceeded through technically correct legal procedures that had been corrupted through bribery, intimidation, and judicial manipulation to produce predetermined outcomes. The involvement of Queen Isabella in the developing crisis added a personal dimension to the political conflict that made compromise increasingly impossible. Isabella's marriage to Edward had been arranged as part of a diplomatic settlement between England and France, and her initial expectations about her role as queen consort had been shaped by conventional assumptions about royal marriage and queenly dignity. Despenser's influence over her husband violated these expectations in ways that were both personally humiliating and politically dangerous. The crisis that developed over the status of English territories in France provided Isabella with both the opportunity and the justification for her eventual break with Edward's government. The complex feudal relationships that governed English holdings in Gascony had created a situation where Edward owed homage to the French king for territories that he held as sovereign ruler in his capacity as King of England. This legal contradiction had been managed through diplomatic negotiations for decades, but the deteriorating relationship between Edward and the French royal family made traditional solutions increasingly difficult to implement. Isabella's mission to France in 1325 was intended to resolve these territorial disputes through family diplomacy that would avoid the military confrontation that Edward could not afford. The Queen's intimate knowledge of French court politics and her personal relationships with French royal family members made her the obvious choice for such delicate negotiations. But her success in achieving a diplomatic settlement also provided her with the opportunity to escape from England and the power base she needed to challenge her husband's authority. The decision to send Prince Edward to France to perform homage for the Gascon territories represented the final catastrophic error in judgment that made Edward's downfall inevitable. By placing both his wife and his heir beyond the reach of his authority, the king had given his enemies control over the two most important sources of legitimacy for any medieval monarchy. Isabella could claim to be protecting her son's interests against his father's misgovernment, while Prince Edward's presence provided the alternative source of royal authority that any successful rebellion required. The invasion of England that began on September 24, 1326, was the culmination of months of careful preparation by Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer that transformed a personal dispute between the royal couple into a full-scale rebellion against Edward's authority. The force that landed at Orwell in Suffolk represented far more than a simple invasion by foreign enemies. It was a dynastic revolution that combined legitimate grievances against royal misgovernment with personal ambitions that would ultimately prove as destructive as the regime it replaced. The speed with which Edward's support collapsed as Isabella's forces moved inland revealed how completely his government had lost the confidence of England's political class. Local officials who should have organized resistance instead opened their gates to the invaders. Military commanders who had sworn personal loyalty to the king either defected to Isabella's cause or simply disappeared rather than fight against overwhelming odds. Most tellingly, the common people of England welcomed Isabella as a liberator rather than resisting her as a foreign invader. Edward's flight toward Wales with Hugh Despenser represented the final breakdown of royal authority and the king's recognition that his only hope for survival lay in escape from England altogether. The desperate nature of their journey revealed how completely the king had been abandoned by everyone except his most intimate associates. The man who had ruled England for nearly 20 years was reduced to wandering through the Welsh countryside like a common fugitive. dependent on the uncertain loyalty of local supporters who might betray him to his enemies at any moment. The capture of Edward and Despenser at Neath Abbey in November 1326 marked the effective end of the king's reign and the beginning of the final phase of a drama that would culminate in one of the most notorious royal deaths in English history. The treatment of Hugh Despenser following his capture provided a preview of the fate that awaited anyone who had been closely associated with Edward's government. Despenser's execution on November 24th combined the legal forms of traditional royal justice with innovations in cruelty that reflected the extraordinary hatred his rule had generated among England's political class. The favourite was hanged, drawn, and quartered with ceremonial brutality that was designed to erase any memory of his former power and influence. Isabella and Mortimer's handling of Edward's deposition revealed both sophisticated political intelligence and careful attention to the legal forms that would legitimize their seizure of power. Rather than simply murdering the king and claiming the throne through conquest, they created an elaborate constitutional framework that would justify Edward's removal while preserving the principle of legitimate royal succession through his son. The Parliament that was convened in January 1327 provided a forum for the formal articulation of charges against Edward and the legal basis for his abdication. Edward's forced abdication on January 21, 1327, represented the legal culmination of a process that had begun with his marriage to Isabella nearly 20 years earlier. The ceremony was designed to preserve the fiction that Edward was voluntarily relinquishing power rather than being overthrown by force, but the presence of armed guards and the obvious coercion involved made such pretenses largely meaningless. The former king's tears during the abdication ceremony reflected both his recognition of the hopelessness of his position and his genuine anguish at losing the throne his father had bequeathed to him. The transfer of Edward to Berkeley Castle in April 1327 marked the beginning of the final phase of his life and the implementation of a plan that Isabella and Mortimer had probably been developing since before their invasion of England. The choice of Berkeley Castle as Edward's prison was not arbitrary, but reflected careful consideration of both the practical and symbolic requirements for dealing with a deposed king. The castle's remote location made rescue attempts unlikely, while its association with the Berkeley family provided plausible deniability for whatever might happen to its royal prisoner. Thomas Berkeley's appointment as Edward's custodian created the perfect cover for the conspiracy that was already taking shape around the former king's eventual elimination. Berkeley's personal grievances against Edward, combined with his family relationship to Roger Mortimer, made him a natural ally in any plot against the deposed king's life. More importantly, Berkeley's ownership of the castle, where Edward would die, provided the conspirators with complete control over the physical circumstances of the murder and the ability to ensure that no independent witnesses would contradict their official account. The final conspiracy that would claim Edward's life involved a network of participants whose identities and motivations revealed the complexity of the forces that had aligned against the former king. Roger Mortimer provided the political authority and strategic planning necessary for such a dangerous undertaking. Isabella contributed the royal warrant that would authorize Edward's elimination while protecting her from direct responsibility for his death. Thomas Berkeley supplied the location and the institutional cover that would make the murder possible. The actual killers, John Maltravers and Thomas Gurney, were chosen for their combination of personal loyalty to Mortimer and their lack of any independent power base that might make them dangerous witnesses after the deed was accomplished. Both men were professional soldiers whose careers depended entirely on Mortimer's continued favour, and who could therefore be trusted to carry out their orders without question or subsequent betrayal. The method selected for Edward's murder reflected careful consideration of multiple requirements that made conventional assassination techniques unsuitable for this particular victim. The killing needed to be undetectable to any subsequent examination of the body. It needed to provide sufficient suffering to satisfy the psychological needs of Edward's enemies for revenge. Most importantly, it needed to send an unmistakable symbolic message about the consequences of the sexual behavior that had ultimately destroyed Edward's reign. The signal for Edward's murder came in the form of a carefully worded letter that reached Berkeley Castle sometime during the afternoon of September 20th, carried by a messenger who had been riding since dawn from wherever Isabella and Mortimer were holding court. The letter's language was deliberately ambiguous, designed to provide instructions that could be interpreted as authorization for murder while maintaining plausible deniability for its authors. The messenger who delivered this death warrant would be long gone before the deed was accomplished, carrying no knowledge of what his message had set in motion. Thomas Berkeley's absence from the castle during the crucial night was not a coincidence, but a carefully planned element of the conspiracy that would allow him to claim ignorance of Edward's fate while providing his subordinates with the freedom to act without fear of interference. The actual killers who entered Edward's chamber sometime after midnight were John Maltravers and Thomas Gurney, two men whose loyalty to Roger Mortimer was absolute and whose understanding of the political necessity for Edward's death made them willing participants in what was about to unfold. The equipment they brought to Edward's chamber reflected the careful preparation that had gone into planning this murder. The red-hot iron rod that would be the instrument of death had been heated in a furnace until it glowed white-hot in the darkness. The cow's horn through which it would be inserted had been specially prepared to provide a channel that would direct the burning metal into Edward's body while protecting the external flesh from marking. Most crucially, they had brought sufficient manpower to overcome any resistance that the former king might offer to his fate. The actual process of the murder began with the overwhelming death of Edward's person through the coordinated action of multiple killers who pinned him to his bed while preventing any possibility of escape or effective resistance. The psychological torture that preceded the physical assault was an integral part of the conspirators' plan and reflected their determination to maximize Edward's suffering before his death. The former king was forced to understand exactly what was about to happen to him and why his enemies had chosen this particular method of execution. The insertion of the horn into Edward's body required careful positioning and considerable force to overcome the natural resistance of flesh and muscle to this kind of penetration. The horn's purpose was not just to provide a channel for the hot iron, but to prevent the external burning that would have revealed the true cause of death to any subsequent examination. The moment when the white-hot iron rod was pushed through the horn into Edward's body marked the achievement of the conspirators' primary objective, while simultaneously creating the kind of suffering that would satisfy their desire for revenge against the man who had brought such destruction upon England. The burning metal seared through internal organs with a heat so intense that it instantly cauterized the wounds it created while destroying vital structures necessary for life. The pain was so severe that it overcame even Edward's formidable physical strength and forced from him the screams that would become the most notorious element of the entire episode. Contemporary chroniclers who described these screams emphasized both their volume and their inhuman quality, suggesting that the agony Edward experienced transcended normal human endurance and produced sounds that were more animal than human in their intensity. The duration of Edward's suffering before death finally brought release remains uncertain, but the nature of the injuries inflicted suggests that his agony continued for a considerable time before the destruction of vital organs made continued life impossible. The burning iron had been designed to cause maximum pain while avoiding immediate death, ensuring that Edward would experience the full measure of punishment that his enemies felt his crimes deserved. Only after this prolonged torture had satisfied their desire for vengeance did the former king finally succumb to injuries that no medical knowledge of the 14th century could have treated. The immediate aftermath of the murder revealed the careful planning that had gone into concealing the true circumstances of Edward's death, while creating an official narrative that would satisfy the political requirements of the new regime. The official announcement of Edward's death that was dispatched to his son Edward III on September 23rd was carefully crafted to provide a plausible explanation for the former king's demise, while avoiding any details that might raise suspicions about the true circumstances involved. The letter described Edward as having died peacefully in his sleep after a brief illness, a common explanation for unexpected deaths in an age when medical knowledge was limited and sudden death was not uncommon, even among relatively young and healthy individuals. The immediate response to news of Edward's death revealed the success of Isabella and Mortimer's conspiracy in eliminating the primary threat to their authority, while maintaining the fiction that the former king had died from natural causes. The elaborate funeral arrangements that were organized for Edward's burial served multiple political purposes beyond the obvious requirement to provide appropriate honors for a former king. The ceremony at Gloucester Abbey was designed to demonstrate the new regime's respect for royal dignity, while simultaneously celebrating the end of Edward's disastrous reign. However, the very success of the conspiracy to murder Edward also contained the seeds of its eventual destruction through the psychological and political pressures it created within Isabella and Mortimer's relationship. The shared knowledge of their involvement in regicide created a bond between the conspirators that was both strengthening and corrupting, binding them together through complicity in the ultimate crime, while simultaneously making each of them a potential threat to the other's security. The gradual emergence of rumors about the true circumstances of Edward's death reflected both the inherent difficulty of concealing such a dramatic crime and the political utility of the murder story for Edward III's government after it had eliminated Isabella and Mortimer from power. The red-hot poker narrative that began to circulate in the 1330s served multiple purposes for the new regime, providing both a horrifying explanation for Edward's fate that justified revenge against his killers and a cautionary tale about the consequences of the sexual behavior that had allegedly contributed to his downfall. The personal fates of the principal conspirators in Edward's murder also demonstrated the inherent instability of any political system based on violence and deception. Roger Mortimer's execution in 1330 was directly related to his involvement in Edward's death and reflected Edward III's determination to distance himself from the crimes committed during his minority. Isabella's forced retirement from political life served a similar purpose, while allowing the new king to demonstrate both filial piety and political prudence. The murder of Edward II represents far more than the elimination of a single ineffective monarch. standing instead as a pivotal moment in the development of English political culture that established lasting precedents for the relationship between royal authority and constitutional government, while revealing fundamental truths about power, sexuality, and justice that continue to resonate in contemporary political discourse. The immediate significance of Edward's death lies in its demonstration that medieval concepts of divine kingship and royal inviolability could be overcome when political necessity demanded the removal of a ruler whose continued existence threatened the stability of the realm. The sophisticated legal and constitutional framework that Isabella and Mortimer created to justify Edward's deposition provided a template for future attempts to limit royal authority through parliamentary action, while establishing the principle that even anointed kings could be held accountable for their political failures. The specific circumstances surrounding Edward's murder also revealed the complex relationship between personal behavior and political legitimacy in medieval society, demonstrating how sexual conduct that violated contemporary moral standards could be transformed into political weapons that justified extreme measures against rulers who failed to conform to expected patterns of royal behavior. The symbolic nature of Edward's death, with its obvious connection to the sexual practices that had allegedly corrupted his reign, established a powerful precedent for using moral condemnation as justification for political violence. The methodical planning and execution of Edward's murder also demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of propaganda and public relations that characterized medieval political culture, revealing how carefully constructed narratives could be used to justify extreme actions while concealing their true motivations and methods. The success of the conspirators in maintaining their cover story for several years after the murder showed both the effectiveness of medieval information control and the willingness of contemporary audiences to accept official explanations that supported their political preferences. The ultimate lesson of Edward's tragedy lies not in the specific details of his personal failures or the particular brutality of his death, but in what his fate reveals about the fundamental vulnerability of political authority that depends more on personal relationships than institutional structures. Edward's destruction was made inevitable, not by his sexual preferences or his political incompetence alone, but by his inability to distinguish between private desires and public responsibilities in ways that made effective governance impossible. The story of Edward II ultimately serves as a permanent reminder that political power without moral constraint inevitably leads to corruption and violence, while demonstrating that even the most carefully constructed systems of authority can be overthrown when they cease to serve the legitimate interests of the people they are supposed to protect. His death marked not just the end of one man's life, but the conclusion of a particular vision of royal authority that could not survive the pressures of political reality and moral judgment. The red-hot poker that ended Edward's life has become a symbol of the ultimate price of political failure and personal corruption. A reminder that power without wisdom, authority without restraint, and privilege without responsibility inevitably lead to destruction. The precision with which his enemies planned his death reflected their understanding that some crimes against political order require responses that are equally methodical and absolute in their finality.